It's 4 p.m. Stand up. It's count time. It's time for every man and woman to stand up and be counted. I'm Brother LD Azobra, and I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Count Time Podcast. We got some special shows here this month. We got a lot to share, and we want you to be a part of it, and we don't want you to miss any of these shows. So please take your time and scroll down right now and hit the subscribe button. That way you can catch each show each week throughout this month and the months to come. Also, please like and share Count Time to all your friends and loved ones. Thank you once again, and we were looking forward to you joining in each week into Count Time.
Hello, I am Dr. Joyce Marie Jackson, Chair of the Department of Geography and Anthropology at Louisiana State University. So we would really like to thank Count Time and LD Azobra, as well as Cultural Crossroads, for giving us this opportunity to just feature some of our speakers so that others can hear them that did not attend the conference. As we enter Women's History Month, we are sort of rolling off the back of Black History Month, and there were many wonderful programs that took place all around the country, which is something that, we really celebrate 365 days of the year, but we just kind of focus more on it during the month of February. Well, during the month of February, we also had this conference called Navigating the Storms of Slavery, Reflect, Restore, and Reclaim. And this conference was held at the LSU Alumni Center at Louisiana State University. And it was co-sponsored by the Department of Geography and Anthropology, which I am the chair of the department and also the coordinator of the conference. And our co-host was the Southern University Law Center, where John Pierre is the chancellor. During the conference, there were a number of very impactful keynote speakers and panelists. And since this is Women's History Month, we would like to feature a few of those speakers on the program. We're starting with Dr. Ruth Simmons. Dr. Ruth Simmons is a remarkable individual whose journey from being a sharecropper's daughter from Texas to becoming the president of 3 prestigious universities. Her story is nothing short of being extraordinary. Hailing from humble beginnings, her path to success is a testament to her resilience and commitment to education. Upcoming, we have Dr. Marianne F Giorlando. She will be our next speaker, and she's an associate professor, a retired associate professor at Grambling State University. And she will be speaking on what we call double jeopardy, enslaved and incarcerated women in the state of Louisiana, historically. Monique Verdin. Monique is, she gave us really a very insightful talk on her community, which is the Houma Nation. And she's talked about the environment, how they are losing their homes because of erosion, coastal erosion. She also talked about health issues as well as the educational system and its impact on the Houma community. And so she's also produced a film called Louisiana, My Love. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy Dr. Marianne F Giorlando.
Usually I use my hands to talk. I didn't realize I had the mic in my hand. It's going to be a bit complicated. I think I need a third hand here. And you're going to have to remind me to keep the mic here. All right. One disclaimer. I'm trained as a sociologist and emphasize criminology/corrections because I needed a job in graduate school, and the job was in the prison. That was in the old days of the Pell Grant. So consider the way I talk about things today from that training, huh? And I'm not from around here, maybe, as you can tell by the way I speak. And give me a drink later and then get really thin. Okay. Now, just here we go. a quote from one of the official documents of the year-end penitentiary reports in Louisiana from before the Civil War. The board would bring to your notice the case of a Negro woman named Celeste, sent to the penitentiary from the parish of St. Landry. She was convicted of the crime of striking a white person named Alois Laverne. The said slave Celeste was the property of the state of Louis Chercher of said parish and was sentenced for life by a court composed of W. Boutet and B. Martel, justices of the peace, and 10 slave owners. The papers doubtless in proper form. But it appears to this board as a thing almost past belief that the said slave Celeste could be a proper subject for judicial action or for imprisonment in the penitentiary. She appears to be at least 100 years of age, scarcely able to sit or stand, and must have been a charge upon the estate for many years. She, of course, can be of no value. And under the circumstances, the board recommends the pardon of said slave, and that she be returned to the owners, and that if the state has paid the owners of said slave, Celeste, that they be required to return it. And if they have not yet received anything from the state, that the auditor be instructed not to audit any claim for the said slave, all of which is respectfully submitted. Celeste's story, striking of white, sentenced for life, is the story of the forgotten women who were in fact incarcerated in this building from 1835 to 1862, 1863, well, much later for the other women, but for the enslaved women up until 62 or 63, we can document them. The official state penitentiary was referred to as the Walls. It's located here, it was located here in Baton Rouge. Sometimes I transpose myself and I think I'm there. It doesn't exist anymore, but it's the site of the federal courthouse between Laurel and 4th. And every time I'm in Baton Rouge, I go down that road to get on the highway to go back up north. The old penitentiary in this picture really is probably around 1900. It's from a postcard. This referred to as the Walls. It was a cement wall. It was a penitentiary very similar to northern penitentiaries. Even though the South resisted doing penitentiaries of this kind, they all eventually built one. Louisiana was in the phase of the second group of penitentiaries being built down south. And that's because the Northerners not only encompassed changing penitentiaries, at the same time, there was a move, the reform was to abolish slavery, so clearly the South was resistant to do something that was associated with abolishing slavery. But this is the Walls, and note the armed guard on the, next to the tower, unlike nowadays. These are the dimensions of the penitentiary. The penitentiary itself was at the end of the property, and there was a long a yard there for them to do all sorts of work in. But for 90% of the time that they were housed in the penitentiary at Baton Rouge, they were within the walls, all right? They were not outside yet. Don't mess it up with your ideas of Angola and the plantation. We're not talking about a plantation at all yet. It was on the edge of Baton Rouge initially, but as many penitentiaries were built in the United States, eventually the city grew up around them, and the penitentiary wound up in the center of the city, which created a problem for the people that lived there. Louisiana, which way did it go? Okay. Anyway, the grounds were sold, and by the city, and the city moved the state outside the city limits, even though that function of the prison at that point, which was the receiving station for the whole system, was maintained in Baton Rouge, but outside the city limits until mid-1930s. People don't, if there are students here, please, nobody's done that, you know, I'm going to keep saying, nobody has done this research yet, please. All right, so I started out of curiosity after reading Tom Carlton's work, Politics and Punishment, that still the prison history, even though it's maybe conservative, although he was very critical of politicians, it's still the standard history of the history of the penitentiary in Louisiana. Clearly missing a lot. And the first thing that I saw in reading it was, he didn't mention the women, except at one point where they were classified for work later on in its history. So I took it upon myself to go to the state. Well, I was going to Baton Rouge with a friend, and she dropped me off at the state library while she was doing her work. I wanted to look at these original documents just to see what was going on. Lo and behold, this is what I find, and this is why Dr. Jackson invited me here today, right? But remember, I'm a criminology sociologist. And you all have taught me a lot already today. I'm thinking, gee, I wish I attended this conference before I did my talk. You know, that I'm going to edit as I go along the way. And realize this was in the beginning of my research also. But imagine my shock when I saw these official documents. Number one is Adeline the slave. Cornelia, a slave, Mary Cull, Mary Grogan, Sabrina Moore, Mrs. John Rofish, Sophie, a slave. What is going on in Louisiana, say I? No matter, we generally have had assumptions, and historically, even scholars have had the assumptions that women were not incarcerated like men were incarcerated, right? One of our assumptions about the history of women in penitentiaries and prisons. The second one is that, well, if they were there, they were certainly not there for a very long period of time, and because of shorter sentences to start with for the women, and that was true almost to the turn of the last century, And then because of clemency. And you'd be surprised about the history of clemency in this state. Yeah, we were never where we are now. That's all I want to say. Okay. All right, so that's the second one. And thirdly, clearly the enslaved were not incarcerated. Why would they be incarcerated? And that's why it's double jeopardy, So those are the big surprises, and and Celeste's story and this list of women already is saying Celeste was sentenced to life, right? How could that be? But maybe she was only one woman, right? And maybe these are only a scattered couple of enslaved women. But as a sociologist, I have to chart it, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the chart. And these are the percentages. What do we see here, and particularly, and I'm just doing the decade of the 50s because it makes a clear picture of what is going on now. The women, they're generally 5% of the total prison population in the 1850s. If you would look at the Louisiana Department of Corrections and Public Safety briefing book for June 2023, what's the percentage of women in the penitentiary now? They're 5.4%. And what I want to say here is that it is significant. People will say, you know, how different the prison system was after the Civil War rather than before the Civil War, because there weren't a lot of African American, there weren't a lot of black people there, you know, and there weren't enslaved there. the total enslaved or black population, which was enslaved except for a few free people of color, was a third, all right? That's significant that, you know, and yet historians for years until very recent years have dismissed that and said it was of no importance. The fact that they were there, I believe, was of importance, and scholars after me agree, huh? So who are the women? Are they like Celeste? Are they different from Celeste? Where do they come from? And realize I'm using official documents initially, which are slanted, huh? They're black and white. They're enslaved and free. There are 33 enslaved women. Huh? Yes, I didn't. There are 5 free women of color and 23 white women. And so I identified 61 total women that were there, and there are a couple of scholars later that have worked with this, and we haven't come up with more than 61. I think there may have been more white women there, because the white women did get shorter sentences and did get in and out faster, and it could be that they were not listed. Those official documents, as you saw in that first image of the listing, in fact listed them by name, huh? But they only listed them by name at the year end, like on December, the last day of December, and so they could have missed somebody that came in and out in a shorter time than a year. Where they come from. Now this is quite interesting, and it makes, you know, I have searched the enslaved women that were in the penitentiary. The enslaved women came from Louisiana and they came from Virginia, all right? I haven't found any for which the documents were available that I can trace back to Africa, that I can trace back to Gwendolyn Minlow Hall's work. We might be able to, but I don't think so. The immigrants were Irish and Italian, huh? And all of the white women, I think I'll get to that in a chart. So, not surprising, 1850 census for Louisiana, a quarter of the people were foreign born. For New Orleans, half of them were foreign born, not surprising, it's a port of entry, right? And certainly the Irish was the largest immigrant group. And I must say I found my mother in the record. It wasn't my mother, but it was Rose Owens, was listed in the criminal records when I was researching, when I was doing this research. Not surprising. And where'd they come from? Now, all of the white women but one came from New Orleans. So they were easy to trace and find information for, weren't they? And you all know the trials and tribulations, not of doing this just the straight genealogy, but the newspaper work and all the other work that where it's difficult to find the enslaved, huh? And that's why the runaway documents are so important if we can combine them with the genealogy also, huh? The enslaved women were mostly from southern Louisiana, from the sugar and cotton plantations. There were the couple up north, and I could cajole you with the stories of traveling all over the state during the summers, tracing these people, and finding the records. Some of them, people had to go up on a ladder because nobody had asked for anything that old before, you know. They didn't let me go up on the ladder. I'm still suspicious about one of them. I think it was there, you know, but the woman who went up the ladder claimed it wasn't. But anyway. Okay, property and other crimes. And Douglas's slave has suggested this groundwork in the slave code. Ordinary folks think the slave code or the black code didn't come along until after Reconstruction or later. They associate it with Jim Crow. We know in Louisiana that the black code originated very early on. It was called the Code Noir. And there was a whole section devoted to criminal offenses for the enslaved, right? and realize, and if John Bardis was here, I would have him intersperse with the presentation and say, now, update me here, please, because he, in fact, has gone further with a lot of this work. But what we see is that the enslaved women were incarcerated only for so-called violent crimes. And realize I'm being very careful with the language here. They were not violent people because they happened to be incarcerated for a crime that was considered a violent crime, right? And most of the white women were incarcerated for property crimes, although a couple of them were infamous in their own rights. So how did enslaved people get in prison? Through the Black Code. And Judith Schaefer years ago used this frame, this term called property converted to humanity for punishment. Now, generally, the enslaved were considered as property, right? They were of value. And always think about the money here. We have to trace the money, and you got to trace the money in the penitentiary also, right? The minute an enslaved person was charged with a crime from the Black Code section, they immediately were converted to being full human beings and fully responsible for that behavior all of a sudden, just like that. Huh? You know, and that one's real hard to get. It's still hard to this day for me to get my head turned around like that. How did people think that way? How did the criminal justice system then that processed them legally, for crimes, how did they then see them as fully human beings responsible for that behavior? I'm not sure, I can't get there in my own brain, Well, then they're processed, they're charged, they're processed, they're convicted, they're sentenced to hard labor. And 99% of the time in the Black Codes, in the criminal section of Black Codes, those offenses were, all of them were considered severe, and most of those cases, they were capital crimes. From striking a white, as Celeste had done, and we don't even know if the woman was her owner or not, But all of those crimes were capital crimes, and a good number of these women that were in the penitentiary were already were commuting from execution to life imprisonment. Right? And so the crimes in the Black Code, more of them, punishment more severe. Now, I'm Celeste, I get convicted. What's going to happen? And we heard it in the quote about Celeste. Her owners the state technically had to buy Celeste from their owners in order to incarcerate her and then supervise her. Then they had to transfer ownership, all right? So the owners had to be compensated. And where you find all those records are in the auditor's records in the state archives, all right? And I guess I saw the word auditor in one of these accounts, and well, probably in Celeste's. Although that account I didn't find probably for a year or two, And it's the longest description within official records. Clearly, official records are limited. So the state gets control of that person. But you see how they're worried about the money with Celeste's story, because if the owners had been compensated for her, and clearly she couldn't produce, she couldn't make money for the owner, is what this description is saying, and she clearly couldn't have made money for the penitentiary either, right? Because she was so old she could hardly stand up on her own, right? So, all of these people had to be compensated, and that's the way we would trace them through the auditor's records. If the owners aren't there immediately, then you can find that. So here's one of the topics, not one of the women, but it's the list in the archives, the payments to owners of the slaves convicted of crimes. Exceptions. There were a few enslaved women that didn't get life in sentence, all right? And how and why did that happen? Well, Louisa only got 3 years for arson. And how did that happen? Well, as I dig deeper and deeper in it, and I think all of you that have worked on this know it takes years. We don't ordinarily find a collection sitting in any one place. You're doing a lot of traveling and a lot of running around and a lot of help from people along the way as to where to go next, right? And clearly I wasn't trained as a historian, so I was really stumbling through all of this. Well, Fanny Sweet, and I'm still finding out, is Louisa's owner. It turned out that Fanny Sweet was one of those owners in New Orleans who in fact was well known for her brutal treatment of the slaves that she owned. And it was a neighbor, I believe, that turned her in, or complained about Fanny Sweet treatment to the police, and then the police, and Louisa had set fire to a corner of the wallpaper, and that's how she was charged. But the minutes then that revealed that in fact the jury decided that, and the jury were made of slaveholders. You know, they had a really good chance of getting off, didn't they? The tribunal for the enslaved were slaveholders. But they did say in the minutes that due to the circumstances of the event, we're only going to give her 3 years. Very, very unusual. The other one, and there's no comprehension about why with Adeline. Adeline got a manslaughter charge of 25 years. That case went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and the appeal was that manslaughter is not even in the slave code. You can't charge her with manslaughter. And if you're going to charge her with manslaughter, the limit is 20 years, so you can't give her 25 years, and you can't charge her with manslaughter. And besides, and this is the kicker, her owner can't get any compensation unless that enslaved person is convicted for life, unless they're going to lose their property for the rest of the lifetime of. You see, how do you talk about this? Unless the owner's going to lose the lifetime of the property? Right, okay. I'm still struggling with it after all these decades, huh? I'm not going to talk about Anne Jane Doyle, that's another one. So where are the women in the penitentiary? As a sociologist, I thought I was going to find the subculture of the women in the penitentiary. I thought I was going to find all this discussion about how they interacted with one another. And I didn't point out in that chart that most times there was only one white woman among 15 to 20 black women. So clearly the black women had to be telling the white woman what to do, right? And I'm ready, you know, I see this emerging to begin with, and I'm going to find out. I still haven't found such stories. We might be able to infer what went on, but there are no quotes there yet. You know, I'm not saying they're not going to be found. But what are the women doing? Or where are they first? The first quote I find is by the physician, and the physician's reports in these documents seem to be humanitarians. How am I doing on time?
You have 25.
Hmm?
You have 25 minutes. I'm going to hold up 10 minutes,
Okay.
and then I'll hold
Yeah,
up.
I can't see it.
Oh,
I can't
sorry.
see her here.
Okay. 10 minutes, I'll wait.
First quote I find. From the present arrangement of the apartments for female convicts, it's impossible to keep them clean, being two large unfinished rooms occupied in common by women and children. Hold on to the children idea for a minute, all right? If these large unfinished rooms were divided into smaller ones well furnished, it would add much to their cleanliness and health. Well, fortunately for the women, this is the inside view of that yard space within the walls, all right? A little bit later, clearly. But behold, luckily for the women, there's a fire in 1856 that destroys that unfinished room where the women were kept with their children. And they built a building for the women. And it's a 3-story building. You see it in the corner. It's surrounded by a plank fence. The bottom floor is the wash house because the women are doing the wash and the mending and the sewing is what they're doing for the men there. And the quotes are something like, well, it's good to keep the women here away from the men because it won't distract the men from their work. I've been informed by northern stories of women in penitentiaries where sometimes stuff hits the newspaper up north about the awful conditions and how the women are being treated. I have not seen one to this day in Louisiana. And in fact, what we get all the way on through 1961, the perception is whenever there's trouble in the prison, whenever there's a possibility of concern, the women cause it. There's some real twists when we get much later. But this one, so then I read about them building the plank fence and I go, oh, thank God, they're preventing the women from trouble with the men, from the men accosting them, right? No, it's to prevent the men from being distracted by the women and the men can continue with their work is why they built the plank fence. What are they doing? This is Mrs. Doyle. The newspaper reporters often visited the penitentiary, and in fact, visitors, anybody could visit the penitentiary. You just had to pay 25 cents. In the warden's house, which still exists across the street from the federal house, and you could get access. Visitors would come and to Baton Rouge, or people would have friends come and, oh, we're going to take a visit to the penitentiary, as some do for a visit to Angola now, right? All right, so newspaper reporters come in, they are much more likely to describe what the white women are doing, all right? And they're going to be New Orleans or Baton Rouge investigators, and they're going to remember some of the crimes they committed also. But Anne Jane Doyle is, what's key here is she's doing the wash. Where do we got? They're away from where the other prisoners are. There are 4 colored women who wash there along with her, right? And a man keeps watch over them. She looks well and was dressed remarkably clean and neatly. And so here, when I found that initially, I'm hopeful. I'm going to find the subculture. They're working together. The women aren't being segregated. It may be impossible to segregate them as they segregated the men. Okay, the children. I said, hold on for a minute about the children. In my process of doing the research, and this is when genealogy was new even to historians, I had a friend in New Orleans who not only took me in, but taught me how to research many of the records in New Orleans Public Library. She kept saying, look at the census. I go, what about the children? What about the children? I want to find out about the children. And because of that one quote, the children and, they're together in that big room. She goes, Marianne, look at the census. I go, oh, the penitentiary's not going to be in the census, and the women aren't going to. Well, one day she just gave up on me. She got the roll of film, put it on the viewer, and queued it up to the 1860 census. And this is where it is. And I still get chills. Eli, born in the penitentiary. Eli, I think, was 8 or 9 in this one. Eli, Emily, Emily, Washington, born in the penitentiary. And how do we find out who their mothers were? And we make leaps of faith saying, and the way genealogists do it, that presumably the mother is listed before the child. And later research, in fact, have been able to document, I think they've been able to document this, I'm not sure. But here we have Lucinda in 1855, she was 23, and had Eli, who was 3, born in the penitentiary in 1860. Now this is another interesting one, and I only saw that this time as I'm reviewing for this presentation. Because we think about, well, why were the children born in the penitentiary? Who were the fathers? And in fact, what I was able to determine is some of the women showed up at the door pregnant. Some showed up at the door of the pen with under 10-year-old children with them, because we know that the children legally could not be sold away from their mothers until they were 10 years old. And in fact, it looks like some of these women showed up with smaller children when they were convicted. There's also the thought that, why were the children born? Did the penitentiary authorities encourage it, as we understand owners encouraged the women to have children because it produced more property, correct? And here we have Susan, convicted in 1839. She was 51. Her son Washington is 9. She was pretty old to have a baby in that day and age. I mean, it would be considered at the edge nowadays, huh? And perhaps some of us need to go back and look at that with this population, huh? And here we have Joseph, born in the penitentiary, but he's not a convict, is what it says. And it's a man listed before him. Now we know some of the employees actually lived in the walls. So I'm wondering but he's mulatto, huh? So he couldn't be the child of an employee. And we don't know who Joseph is. Okay. So another scholar comes along after me. I'm not going to say how old this initial work is. I was shocked when I found out how many years ago it was that I started this. And another scholar came along after me. I only identified, I think, 7 children. He identified 15, and John Bardis went ahead and used this work also. So we have 15 children that are there in the penitentiary, right? Sometimes we know the mother's name, sometimes we don't. I did, and for some reason or another, well, because we're only concentrating on the enslaved women, somebody sent me to the baptismal records, huh? And I found a white woman there, but then as I found, because they saw the white woman whose child was baptized, who had been born in the penitentiary. But lo and behold, there were 2 enslaved babies that were baptized in the St. Joseph, records in Baton Rouge. We see here, people have used this picture. This is a series of pictures that were taken at the turn of the century. This is another thing where the women are overlooked. This is clearly a woman sitting on the porch inside the walls of the penitentiary. And there's a child there. Now, she could have been the spouse of an employee still at the turn of the century. But the neglect of paying attention to the fact that the women were there this is another example of that. Now, what's going to happen with these children when they come of age? Well, the state decides they have to pass a specific piece of legislation to regulate how those children will be sold away from their mothers who are convicted of a crime. And this is providing for the disposal, even the language, the disposal of such slaves as are or may be born in the penitentiary, the issue of convicts. The law is passed in 48. It has to be advertised in the state newspaper for 30 days. And it's proclaimed that the sheriff's, at the courthouse, and the sheriff's in charge of supervising this transfer or this sale of the babies. And here's one of those ads that's in the paper. I, the undersigned sheriff of the parish of Baton Rouge, will expose at public sale on Saturday, the 5th of June next, 1852, at the courthouse door in the city of Baton Rouge at 12 o'clock for cash. The slave, herein after mentioned, an issue of slaves detained for life and born in the Louisiana penitentiary, to wit, the Negro boy Alfred, age 10 years. Wow. All right. A Negro girl, this was in the official documents, by the name of Henrietta, having arrived at the age of 10 years. She is also sold, and they say how much money she brought. She brought $600. There's some of the babies close to the Civil War, and these were women that brought $1,000 in 1861. Two more of the children, Claire Williams, and the slave Peter, and we see here the calculations. The proceeds went to the free school fund, but a friend of mine that knew that research said, yeah, but there wasn't much money there anyway, so don't make a big deal about it. But it is. It's, the sale of slave children is going to go into an education fund for free children. Yeah, that doesn't ring too well either, does it? Huh? Healthcare. Now this is interesting, although we're not really able to connect. There's evidence of a midwife in the penitentiary, Jane Timms.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
But then that's with questions.
I'm just about at the end.
Okay.
So Jane Timms assisted a few of these women, and we know it by the bills, the paperwork by the leasees. Louisiana did some northern kind of leasing of prisoners before the Civil War. They weren't making money, and they brought in outside people to manage the prisoners. They didn't turn them over completely like they did after the Civil War to the leasee, to S.L. James, but they did turn them over to people who were managers that could presumably get these factory operations to make money. And that would be making shoes and all sorts of other things that competed with outside labor, though. But Jane Timms, we find, sends bills and gets paid for $10 for attending a convict woman. But we've not been able to match up because a couple of the women that she provided services for were already pardoned before they could have been listed in the penitentiary at the year end. So we couldn't really match them up with the birth of one of the children. We also have a record of a woman that eventually, all the guards were male up until this last payroll in 1860. And we have a Mrs. Edwards down here who signed her name with an X. And she's listed with the guards, with the employees. And so we're guessing she was in fact employed to be the matron of the women, but that search is then ended also. Huh? I figured she was probably a relative of somebody that already worked there. I shouldn't take nowadays to then, should I? But that could have been the case, but we haven't been able to find anything more about her. All right, so the advent of the Civil War, what happens to the children? We still have underage children in the penitentiary, not just the mothers. And there's still a debate about what happened to the penitentiary during the Civil War. They realized they had to get the prisoners out of there when a musket went over the wall and fell into the yard, and they go, oh yeah, I guess we better get out of here, And I've been able to document them as far as putting them all on a boat in the river. Now, military historians claim, oh no, they evacuated them all. I don't think so. because I've been able to track some of the men that they got transferred to New Orleans. It's where the state penitentiary people were momentarily. And they were even processed through that court during the Civil War, which again surprised me. All right, so there are letters that go on about the man who's temporarily in charge of the prisoners writes to Butler, our infamous Butler from New Orleans, right? What shall I do with these children? The law in Louisiana says they can be sold. And Butler comes back and says he's not going to sanction any law in Louisiana which enslaves any children of female convicts born in a state prison. Their place of birth is certainly not their fault. Take care, such care of them as would be done with other destitute children. Well, God knows what happened to them, because goodness knows what the institutions were for destitute children at this point in time, right? But we do know, and this, I'm going to stop here, so if there's time for questions. I fumbled around in the sheriff's records when I was doing this research, and I just couldn't figure out. I knew that's where the answer would be, but I didn't know how to use the records. You know, the sociologists, the beginning genealogy work, I didn't know who to go, and Tom Carlin helped me. Tom Carlin hooked me up with the clerk of court even at that point. And I just didn't find this, but that's all right. The scholars come after us, don't they, huh? And he was able, Brett was able to find where the children went, who purchased them, huh? And what's really significant here, folks, Charles McCadden, right? James McCadden, Samuel Islett, and William Pike. They were all employees of the penitentiary, or of the McCaddens were leasees, and Pike and Islett were both former clerks of the penitentiary. So the other folks that made the purchases were not connected to the penitentiary in that way. But this is significant, that employers of the penitentiary system were the ones that purchased these children. You probably want to know what happened to Celeste, don't you? Huh?
Yeah.
What's her P.S.? What happened to Celeste? Oh, one of the women. I have to tell you, I'm in Reconstruction era now with the ladies, following them. I come across, you know, how we're reading the newspapers. Kitty got pardoned.
Oh.
A decade later, she was one of the enslaved women that I wrote a whole paper about at some point. Googled it. That's a good paper, that one. Anyway, but you know that Kitty she was not the perpetrator of that crime. Her owner, the woman, was, and the woman never went to prison, but the guy she was having an affair with did. And, you know, because the husband died, right? It was one of those deals. And Kitty got not the worst. She got life imprisonment. But, you know, she's easily convicted in 57. And then, oh, I don't have the date. Yeah, I do. Her pardon comes along in 1874. God knows where she is in Louisiana at this point, or if she even knows she was pardoned, right? Celeste. Physicians report to the board of directors in 1854. This is a list of the people who died. Old woman, September 27.
Wow.
Age 100 or 120 years. And the other list, Celeste Slave. These are the ones that died of yellow fever. There was a whole group of them that died. It had to be her. I remember calling a friend of mine and announcing, without any precursor, Billy, Celeste died. He goes, Marianne, is this somebody you know now? Or is this one of the women you're studying I go, oh, it was Celeste in the 1850s, but I just found out she died. You know, they got used to me being immersed in this. All right, we'll finish with that.
And remember, man can shackle the hand, man can shackle the feet, but only you can shackle the mind. The mind is free to travel wherever you dare to take it. Welcome to another edition of Time Podcast.